it's not easy to So we've been pondering the wisdom books of the Bible and the Greek historical situation which gave rise to them, caused them to be written. And the Jews read them, as we saw with the book of Sirach last time, read them in order to remain faithful to the law God had given them, to Moses on Mount Sinai, and to the covenant that he'd established then with them, that he would be their God and protect them if they were faithful to his laws. Same thing applies now. So we're following in the footsteps of the Jews. Remember, Jesus was a Jew. So those were the conditions laid down by God for the Jews. And we looked at the two great, this is a few weeks ago, we looked at the two great leaders who had helped the Jews to return to the promised land after their exile in Babylon. Remember that? Ezra and Nehemiah. It is these two great men that helped them to come back to Jerusalem, to restore the temple, to rebuild the temple so that it could be worshipped again after it was destroyed by the Assyrians, remember? And then after these two prophets' deaths, what happened then? What happened after the death of Ezra and Nehemiah? Little is known, if we're honest, about the condition of life in Judah immediately after their deaths. But it's generally agreed that before Alexander the Great came along, the Greek Alexander the Great, in the final years of the Persian Empire, which was the big world power before Alexander came along, until he came and swept away the Persians. During the last years of the Persian Empire, power in the Promised Land was held by a ruling group of Jewish aristocratic families and priestly families. And they set up in Jerusalem this very familiar word that we can, that was in existence when Jesus was tried before Pilate. Remember the word Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is just a Greek word for Senate or council. And it's at this time that the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, as the governing body of the Promised Land, was set up under the authority of the high priest of the temple. You've got the temple there rebuilt. The Sanhedrin is the governing body. Like now, we've got Westminster Abbey, I suppose you could say, in this country as the temple. And then next to Westminster Abbey, you've got Parliament. So the Sanhedrin stands for Parliament, you could say. And all that was set up at this time. Then, as we saw, Alexander the Great comes along, the Greek Macedonia, which is just south of Greece, and he conquered the whole of the Persian Empire. It fell, but it was a very meteoric career. He was only 33 when he died. Before he died, he divided, this was the crucial thing, he divided his empire between his 5 generals, his right-hand men. But after his death, these 5 generals then struggled for the power over several years. And this struggle between these 5 generals caused great instability in the ancient world during those several years when they tried to get the major power. Reminds you of the Lord of the Rings in a way, because everybody wants power. And these 5 generals weren't happy with just having a part of the empire. They wanted all of that. Alexander's empire. And all that went on until 312 BC, when two leaders emerged victorious from those five. One was a man called Ptolemy, and the other one was called Seleucus. And Ptolemy governed the sort of western side of the empire, centered on Egypt, and Seleucus governed basically the eastern part of Alexander's empire, really around about what the territory of the former Babylonian Empire, who were in power before the Persians, remember, which then became the Persian Empire. So now, instead of one big empire like the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians succeeding the Babylonians succeeded the Assyrians, and the Persians succeeded the Babylonians, and then Alexander again had one empire, huge empire, world empire. Now, after all this struggle, we end up with two empires, one under Ptolemy and one under Seleucus. So one centered on Egypt, the other one centered in Mesopotamia to the east, where Abraham had come from and where the Babylonian Empire had been centered. And so two basic power blocks. Now, the promised land, Palestine, the Jews were in the middle, like the devil, between the devil and the deep blue sea, as it were, between these two empires. And sometimes Ptolemy in the west ruled Palestine. At other times, Seleucus ruled Palestine from the east. And don't just think about Ptolemy living for a long time and Seleucus living for a long time. What happened was their families, the dynasty they established, ruled. So their successors took over from them and took the power. So Seleucus formed a dynasty, and it was his descendant called Antiochus III, not Antiochus IV. This was just before Antiochus IV. This is called Antiochus III the Great. Finally took control of Palestine permanently, so that the Ptolemy dynasty was pushed out, so that it no longer exerted any power outside of Egypt. So the Seleucids, after Seleucus, the Seleucid dynasty, quite difficult to pronounce, they took over major power in 199 BC and were in power really until the Romans were coming along. When the Romans took the power, as they'd taken power, as Alexander had taken power from the Persians and formed the Greek Empire, which the Seleucids now were ruling, along with a little bit with the Ptolemaics. Then the Romans were going to come along and take the power from the Greeks, as we will see. So when the dynasty of the Seleucids took power in Palestine, what were these Jewish aristocratic families who had been ruling in Palestine up to this time? How were they going to react? Well, they played one side off against the other. The Ptolemaics against the Seleucids, because they wanted as much influence and power as they could get. And there were basically two prominent Jewish families that were battling out for power in Jerusalem at this time. One called the Tobiads and another called the Onaiads. Tobiads were basically the tax collectors, again, very familiar term to us, because again, this whole business of collecting taxes for the ruling power, all that's happening now. So this ruling Jewish family of the Tobiads were the ones who collected the taxes for the Seleucids, okay, who were the Greek rulers at this time, which said. The Onaiads tended to hold, not all the time, but most of the time, held the high priestly office. So they controlled the temple. But the Tobiites wanted to control the temple as well as the Sanhedrin, the Senate. And so an awful lot of trouble was going on between these two Jewish aristocratic families, and the Seleucids did not like it because it was causing trouble. Like the Romans in Jesus' time, they were always sending in troops to quell down religious unrest in Jerusalem. Exactly the same thing happening now before Jesus comes on the scene, but we can see the everything being set up for, and it's very interesting to see the political structure being set up and the religious structure being set up that would that Jesus would have to deal with when God became incarnate in Jesus Christ. So because of all this trouble between these Jewish families, Antiochus Epiphanes, the one that we're focusing on today, this ruler that caused such terrible persecution for the Jews at this time, Antiochus Epiphanes, the Seleucid ruler, took measures to begin to repress Jewish religion and practice. Now, we've seen this coming over the last few weeks, looking at the wisdom books and why they were written, because they were written in this Greek context, and they were helping the Jews to be faithful to their religion. That's why the wisdom books are in the Bible. Now, one dispute between these families caused a predecessor of Antiochus IV, just to set the scene a bit further back, Seleucus IV, to actually break into the temple. And this is like when the Assyrians came in and devastated the temple all those years before and stole the temple treasures and took them to the Persian Empire ultimately. He broke into the temple and took out all the gold treasures, all the precious vessels that they used for the worship of Yahweh in the temple. He stole a lot of them. Now, when the Oniads, who were in charge of the temple, objected, a man called Jason, who was sympathetic to the Seleucid rulers, to Greek policy, was made high priest, like a puppet high priest. And he wanted the whole the promised land and the Jews to adopt Greek lifestyle. He wasn't forcing anything, but he was encouraging everybody to adopt the way of the Greeks. So Jason had a gymnasium built in Jerusalem. A gymnasium was a feature of every Greek city where the young men used to go and keep fit and perform sports, wrestle, race, and all that. Some young Jewish priests started, instead of doing their holy things, worshipping God and educating the people in the law, gave up all that and started training in sports and running naked, as the Greeks did, racing each other and hiding the fact that they were circumcised. We all know what circumcision is, I suppose, that it's the cutting away of the male foreskin. And this is the practice that had been instituted with Abraham as a sign of all Jewish males would be circumcised as a sign of the covenant with Yahweh that made them different from all the other races. Circumcision was every Jewish boy that was born circumcised. Now, Jason said this wasn't necessary. And these young priests were hiding the fact that they were circumcised. And many of the Jewish upper classes at that time began to take Greek. They changed their names from Hebrew names to Greek names. And they stopped having their sons circumcised and saw themselves as citizens of the Greek Empire, the Seleucid Empire. Then in 171 BC, Jason was replaced by the Seleucid by an even more pro-Greek high priest called, and his name is Greek typically, Menelaus, not a Hebrew name, a Greek name. And he was paying even more taxes from the Jews, collecting more taxes from the Jews to the Seleucids, and pushed on the people Greek ways and Greek culture even more. 2 years later, Jason tried to regain the high priest's office, but to stop this, Jason would have taken the Jews more back to their way of life rather than the Greek way of life. But to stop this, Antiochus sacked the temple completely, took all the treasures, and on top of that, passed many laws forcing now Jews to abandon their way of life and live in the Greek style. The laws involved banning outright circumcision. Parents could not have their baby boys circumcised. Banned the observance of the Sabbath, which is breaking the third commandment. Banned the observance of Jewish feasts like Passover. Banned the Jewish purity laws like washing after meals, all sorts of washing and purification rites that they used to do. And on top of that, the holy places in the temple were defiled. The books of the law contained what for us is the Old Testament were burnt. Jews were forced to eat pork and unclean things and to honor the Greek gods rather than Yahweh, or along with Yahweh, really, because it was really trying to get all the gods together into one God to unify the empire, basically. They didn't want division, they wanted unity. Rings a lot of bells today, globalization, interreligious dialogue, all that. Nothing new under the sun. Because, and all this happened really because many of the upper class Jews before this had been living a Greek way of life. And Antiochus, because of this, Antiochus IV, did not expect much resistance to these laws coming in. But he made a big error of judgment. And Antiochus was forcing this Greek policy, as I said, to unite his empire against the Romans, who were growing in power all the time. The Romans had already taken territory from his empire, and he'd had to pay a huge indemnity towards them because of this. The Romans had taken his son hostage in Rome, his boy, and his boy had been had to live in Rome for 12 years. So Antiochus, trying to survive in this situation, knew that unity was crucial. And he, as I said, he wanted to bring all gods under the name of Zeus, which was the major Greek god, the father of the Greek god pantheon. Lots of other gods as well, but Zeus was the main one, the most powerful one. The Romans took that name and termed it Jupiter. And all this, his idea was to bring political unity against Rome. And so he named himself Epiphanes, which means God manifest. We have the Feast of Epiphany, don't we? Well, it's called Epiphany because it's when Jesus manifests himself as God to the wise men who symbolize the pagan nations that Jesus is coming to save. So that's why we have the Feast of the Epiphany. It just means, Epiphany means manifestation of God. And so he gave himself this title of Antiochus Epiphanes, as God manifest, to make his policies even more effective. If I'm God and I pass these laws, you must know that it is from God himself. So his most terrible action was then to go to the temple in Jerusalem and have it rededicated, not to Yahweh, but to Zeus. I'm not sure whether he had an idol, but I think he did, because they talk about the abomination of desolation. And that's when he had a large statue of Zeus placed in the place where the temple of sacrifice in the Jerusalem temple had been taken away, and this statue of Zeus put in its place. And the idea was that Antiochus wanted to merge three gods into one. There was Zeus, the pagan god, Yahweh, the Jewish god, and Baal, another god that some of the other Semitic peoples worshipped. Baal. Remember Samuel and the prophets of Baal, and these three major deities Antiochus wanted to bring together into one god and call it Zeus.
Some pronounce Baal.
Baal, no, some call it Baal, some call it Baal, okay? They were all, and his idea was to say they're all the same God, but under different names. Jews call this God Yahweh, Greeks call him Zeus, other people call it Baal. And so that was his policy and why he did it. Now, next time we're going to look at the book of Maccabees as the book that records the response of the Jews to Antiochus's policies to fight for their way of life. And we'll see what happens next time. The book, you can have a look at the book of the Maccabees and perhaps see, read ahead and see what happens. But it's very exciting. But you can see that today, nothing new, as I said, is under the sun. The current push all around us, the multiculturalism, globalization. We have an extremely volatile world situation where we have powers with atomic weapons, and the threat of nuclear war is always over our heads. And so the powers that be now are constantly saying, pushing globalization and interreligious dialogue, etc., good in a way, but we've got to be very careful, because at the end of the day, there is one God who is true, God revealed by Jesus Christ. So we can't say that he's just all the other gods, the Hindu gods and the God that there's only one God. All the other gods are false. But we must live together in harmony at the same time, by being understanding, talking to each other, but holding fast to the truth at the same time. Difficult to do this sometimes, but we have to be committed and totally loyal to who Jesus has revealed to us. This is the true God. So it's interesting to see this history, the way it all works out, and to see the comparisons with our own time, that history is always repeating itself. So next time we'll look at the Maccabees. God bless you. See you next Tuesday. God bless. Bye for now.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you, Father John.
Thank you, Father John.
Thank you. God bless you all.